In the end, the subcommittee developed 3 plans, titled Plan A, Plan B, and Plan C. Their general preference was Plan C, and a little later on in the presentation I'll go through some of the details of what's in the plans. At this stage, so I'm just taking you through the process of how we got to this evening, so you'll understand all the things we've gone through, how the public input process has worked and all that, and then we'll dive into the details of the plans themselves. So after that 4.5-week intense period of time, went back to the Transportation Commission at their meeting on December 14th. The Commission felt that they were comfortable with the 3 plans that were developed by the subcommittee, recommended that we start the public input process. So the public comment period was officially opened on December 20th, and on the 21st we finished a City Hall display right out here in the hallway outside of the City Council chambers. That was a display that was in place all the way through the end of the comment period, so roughly a little better than 4 weeks actually. And within that display, there were a series of poster boards that looked something like this one. This is one example. They all had specific topics that talked about either the plans themselves or what the commission was doing, or individual items within some of the plans. There were 12 of them in all that were on display in the hallway. So things like this subcommittee discussed what the subcommittee was doing. The overview talked about some of the common features of all the plans, then each of the 3 Plan A, B, C concepts, and then you get into the more specific items or individual components within some of those plans. This is where things like separated two-way bicycle lanes were introduced, which is a new feature within the City of Moscow. And then finally a project cost for preliminary cost estimates for the 3 plans. Excuse me. This is just a shot of what it looked like as we were finishing setup. We weren't quite done, a couple of posters missing yet, but we had the posters on the walls all the way around, comment box set up here with cards on this long sheet here, which is, this is about a 22-foot long plot of Plan C in this case, because that was the preferred one. Also on this table, there are 3 booklets on either end that have the complete plan sets for A, B, and C. And then we had this interesting little floor graphic here. Plan C is the 2-way separated bike lane, and at its narrowest location, it is 3.5-foot wide lanes and a 1-foot wide buffer. And this is a life-size replica of what that would look like on the street. So 3.5-foot wide lanes from essentially a curb line to a center stripe, 2-way bike traffic, and this 1-foot wide buffer with some vertical elements between the bikes and where the cars would be out here. So we did that to try to give folks a visual understanding of just how big is that. When you see things on paper, they don't always necessarily relate to what it physically would look like on the ground. So that was a feature that we included in that display. We also held 2 open houses here in the council chambers, the first of those on January 11th, the second one on January 18th. In those open houses, we put out the long strip plans, the 22-footers for plans B and A, as well as some additional poster boards with these categories. This other considerations set was really looking at just kind of discussing things were on the other plans, things that the subcommittee had talked about, but not necessarily reached any firm conclusions upon, such as lighting and truck routes and trees, maintaining traffic flow, things of that nature. We also had some boards that had information on the accident history, traffic flow volumes, and then we had the 2016 bike route plan. So that was part of the open house process in those 2 dates. In the end, the public comment period closed January 21st. Should note that this date required the relocation or rescheduling of the Transportation Commission meeting for January. They pushed it back 2 weeks so that we could have a couple of weeks after school started again at the university, so everybody was back in town, give them a period of time to come in and participate, so it wasn't all during a holiday break when people were out of town. At the end, we received a little over 100 comments, written comments, in the system via email and comment cards and those types of things. Of those, about 40% of them stated a preference for a particular plan option. There were some that said this one or that one, A and B typically, but the large majority, roughly 2/3, preferred Plan C out of the 3 options that were proposed. which is the two-way separated bike lane. There were other comments that popped up, just things that, to think about as we go along the way. One of them is just cleaning up some of the catch basin surfaces so that they are not wheel catchers if there are bikes going across them with some of the grates. Again, addressing issues like truck routes and signage. Where do the garbage cans go? What do we do about lighting? Will there be improvements? A lot of these were just questions, some comments upon them. Some concern, and this was a fairly common one, regarding what happens when we remove parking, particularly around the high school and the 1912 Center. Those are areas that are highly congested, a lot of parking demand. Some concern about after-hour events, particularly at the 1912 Center. If we lose any parking within the corridor, that could have an impact. And then events, particularly at East City Park, also a potential impact if some parking is removed in that area. So questions and concerns in the part of the folks submitting input about loss of parking or potential loss of parking. There's some comments as well about just general congestion at the high school with Plan C in particular, with the multiple lane aspect. Are we going to create issues where there could be more conflicts? And then another one that came up a number of times was the issue of maintenance concerns, particularly how do you remove snow? And that's primarily related to Plan C. It has some more challenges than the other two with respect to snow removal, leaf removal, things of that nature. Okay, the Transportation Commission then on January 25th met and went through the input that had been received. They all received in advance a summary of all that input and then the actual scans of the individual documents that were submitted to us. Quite a bit of information. It's in your packets tonight as well. Hopefully you've had a chance to look at it. The commission then talked about, okay, where do we go from here and what did we hear from the people? What should we now do? Well, in general, and I will generalize here because it's, I don't necessarily want to speak for the commission, but they did not seem to really favor plans A and B. They did prefer Plan C, but there was some consternation about Plan C. And they spent a lot of time talking about it during that meeting about how best to address the issues of maintenance and overall safety. And on the maintenance aspect, again, it's that question of Plan C has a vertical element within the road section. So you cannot plow the entire road to the outsides. You have to plow one side of that vertical element or the other side of that vertical element. And so it just complicates things and how best to manage that. And then the safety aspect really relates to turning movements and what do you do at intersections. And so when you've got multiple lanes of cars and bikes going through an intersection and a vehicle wants to turn off a third or come from a side street, making sure that we don't have conflicts there that create safety problems. Okay. So they spent quite a bit of time struggling with this, frankly, about how to manage it, where to ultimately to end up in a recommendation. They did discuss briefly, but on a couple of times through the meeting, other alternatives. They looked, the option of a advisory bike lane was brought forward. One suggestion was made to consider doing a protected bike lane on one side and a regular on the other side. The one that actually probably got more traction than any of the others was the concept of just going to a standard bike lane, so it'd be a striped traditional bike lane on either side of the roadway, consistent with our street standards. At the time, we did not have a name for it. In the process of putting together the packet for this meeting, I did call it Plan D, and we actually did draw it up just so that folks could get a feel for what it looked like, because it was something discussed. But I do need to point out that this was something that was not fully vetted by the Transportation Commission. They touched on it, they talked about it a little bit, but it was mainly in the context of, well, what if Plan C has these complications? What do we do next? How else could we modify this? And the concept of the two standard bike lanes kind of kept coming to the surface as an alternative. They did not take any action on what I'm now calling Plan D. And the other thing I should say is that in the public comment period, we did have some folks suggest standard bike lanes along the 3rd Street corridor. So it was an option that came out of the public comment process. And I think it's beneficial for people to think about the fact when you go to public comment with some concepts, in this case plans A, B, C, what you're looking for is input. And at the end of that process, you take that input and you either modify the concepts that you've created based on, input you received, or in some cases, you may go a different direction and create a different concept or a different plan. So that's really how Plan D came to be, is that initially started with public comments suggesting that as a possibility. Transportation got into it and started talking about it a little bit, and so I felt it was probably an advisable thing to bring that forward as a possible fourth option to consider.